In this section, we'll go from the shoulder to the wrist. We'll look at the bones, joints, and muscles that are involved in 3 different functions: elbow movement, forearm rotation, and wrist movement. We'll also look at the vessels and nerves from the shoulder to just below the elbow. A good many of the muscles that are in the forearm are finger and thumb muscles. We'll leave those out of the picture in this section and see them when we do the hand. We need to give a clear meaning to our usual anatomic terms, medial and lateral, anterior and posterior. When we use those terms in the upper extremity, we imagine the extremity to be fixed in this so-called anatomic position. That's useful, but calling something medial or lateral can become pretty confusing below the elbow because everything can rotate so much. To get our bearings in the forearm and hand, we'll often use the more convenient terms that are derived from the 2 functions, flexion and extension, and from the 2 bones of the forearm, the ulnar and the radius. This is the flexor aspect of the forearm, and this is the extensor aspect. This is the ulnar side, and this side with the thumb on it is the radial side. Let's also understand the terms we use for movements. At the elbow, bending is flexion, straightening is extension. Rotation of the forearm is referred to as pronation and supination. Pronation puts the palm of the hand down, supination brings it up. To remember which is which, remember supination has up in it. At the wrist, this is flexion, this is extension. The 2 sideways movements of the wrist are ulnar abduction and radial abduction. There's one last term to define, the arm. In everyday conversation, this whole thing is the arm. But in anatomy, this is the arm, just this bit here. And this is the forearm. Now let's look at the bones, starting with the humerus. We've looked at its proximal end already. Now let's see the distal end. It's flattened from front to back, with a complicated articular surface and 2 prominent lumps, the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. These are major muscle origins, as we'll see. Above each epicondyle is a ridge, the epicondylar ridge. Here's the lateral one. The articular surface is in 2 parts. The pulley-like trochlea articulates with the ulna. The rounded capitulum articulates with the radius. Now we'll add the radius and the ulna to the picture. The big hollow on the back of the humerus, the olecranon fossa, accommodates the end of the ulna, the olecranon, in full extension. Now let's look at the 2 forearm bones, the radius and the ulna. They're different in that the ulna is bigger proximally, the radius is bigger distally. They're also different in that the radius rotates, the ulna doesn't. The 2 bones are held together by 2 radio-ulnar joints, the proximal and the distal. Forearm rotation happens simultaneously at both these joints. The 2 bones are also held together along most of their length by the strong but flexible interosseous membrane, which prevents the 2 bones moving lengthwise relative to each other. Let's look at the proximal ends of the radius and the ulna. We'll look at the ulna first. The main feature of the proximal end of the ulna is this large curved articular surface. The curve that it forms is called the trochlear notch. It articulates with the trochlea of the humerus. The very proximal end of the ulna is the olecranon. The triceps tendon is attached to it. This projection is the coronoid process. Distal to it, this rough area, the ulnar tuberosity, marks the insertion of the brachialis tendon. This small curved surface, the radial notch, is where the head of the radius articulates. This is the head of the radius. This is the neck. The end of the head articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. Its curved side articulates partly with the radial notch of the ulna and partly with the ligament that surrounds it, as we'll see. Just distal to the neck is the radial tuberosity, which is the insertion for the biceps tendon. Now let's look at this unique joint where two quite different things happen. The humerus articulates with the forearm bones to form the elbow joint, and the forearm bones articulate with each other to form the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Here's the joint with its loose capsule removed and its ligaments intact. Here's the front of the joint in extension, and here's the back of the joint in flexion. The key structure to understand is this remarkable ligament, which not only holds the radial side of the elbow together, but also holds the rotating head of the radius in place against the ulna. It has two parts. This part is the radial collateral ligament. This part is the annular ligament. We'll take the humerus out of the picture for a minute to get a look at the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Here's the trochlear notch of the ulna. Here is the head of the radius, seen end on. The annular ligament, together with the radial notch of the ulna, provides a perfectly fitting socket for the head of the radius to rotate in. Here's the annular ligament with the radial head removed. It's attached to the edges of the radial notch of the ulna. It's shaped like a shallow cup, wider here than here, to fit the radial head, not just round here, but also under here. So the radial head, while it's free to rotate, is otherwise totally trapped. Now let's go back to the intact elbow joint and see how it's held together by its two collateral ligaments. The radial one arises from the lateral epicondyle. It fans out and becomes continuous with the annular ligament. The two parts of this complex ligament hold the humerus and the radial head securely together. What we see here isn't the edge of the ligament, it's the cut edge of the tendon of origin of a muscle, the supinator, which arises from the ligament. We'll see this shortly. Here's the ulnar collateral ligament. It arises from the medial epicondyle and fans out in a triangle. It's attached to the ulna all along the medial side of the trochlear notch. To complete our picture of the elbow joint, here it is with its capsule intact. The capsule is thin and baggy in front and also behind to allow a full range of movement. There's also a very flexible sleeve of joint capsule here between the annular ligament and the neck of the radius. The elbow joint is stable. That means it stays together for two reasons, partly because of the strength of the ligaments, which we've seen, and partly because of the shape of the bones. The humerus and the ulna interlock closely and deeply. Their surfaces are curved in two planes, from front to back and from side to side. The elbow and the proximal radio-ulnar joint are considered to be all one joint because they're enclosed in one continuous space. By contrast, the two joints that we'll look at next, the distal radio-ulnar joint and the wrist joint, are physically separate, even though they're close together. So we'll look at them separately. To understand the distal radio-ulnar joint, let's look at the distal ends of the radius and the ulna. The head of the ulna has a rounded articular surface. This part articulates with the radius. This part articulates with a key structure that we'll see shortly, the triangular fibrocartilage. The pointed tip of the ulna is called the ulnar styloid. The broad distal end of the radius has two articular surfaces. This large one articulates with the proximal row of carpal bones. This small surface articulates with the ulna. This point is the radial styloid. Here's the distal radio-ulnar joint with its capsule intact and with its capsule removed. Here's the structure that holds it together, the triangular fibrocartilage. It's also known as the articular disc. It's attached to the radius here and to the ulnar styloid here. As the distal end of the radius rides around the head of the ulnar styloid provides the pivot point. Now let's look at the wrist joint. Though we often speak of it as one joint, there are really two joints here, very close together. They're called the radiocarpal joint and the midcarpal joint. To understand them, let's look at the bones. We'll look at them this way up. 8 small carpal bones form the carpus. Distal to the carpus are the metacarpal bones, numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The carpal bones are in 2 rows, a proximal and a distal. The bones in each row are attached closely to one another. The 4 bones of the proximal row are the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetral, and the pisiform, which sits by itself on the triquetral. The scaphoid, the lunate, and part of the triquetral articulate with the distal end of the radius to form the radiocarpal joint. The distal surface of the proximal row forms a deeply concave notch which the bones of the distal row fit into. The bones of the distal row are the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. The capitate and part of the hamate project proximally. The bases of the 5 metacarpals articulate with the distal row of carpal bones. The first, the one for the thumb, articulates by itself with the trapezium. The other 4 articulates in a row here. The distal row of carpal bones articulates with the proximal row here to form the midcarpal joint. The projecting capitate and hamate fit into the notch in the proximal row. When flexion and extension occur at the wrist, the movement happens partly at the radiocarpal joint and partly at the midcarpal joint. When radial deviation and ulnar deviation occur, the action happens mainly at the radiocarpal joint. Here's the wrist joint, or rather joints, with much of the capsule removed and the 2 collateral ligaments here and here intact. Here's the radiocarpal joint. Here's the midcarpal joint. The radial collateral ligament goes from the radial styloid to the scaphoid and its neighbor, the trapezium. The ulnar collateral ligament goes from the ulnar styloid to the triquetral and pisiform bones. Here's the wrist joint with the joint capsule intact. The joint capsule is thick and strong all the way round the joint. On the extensor aspect, the capsule forms the broad dorsal radiocarpal ligament. On the flexor aspect, it forms the palmar radiocarpal ligament. Unlike the elbow, which is held together partly by the interlocking shape of the bones, the wrist joint is held together entirely by the strength of its ligaments. The 2 collateral ligaments hold the bones together in radial abduction and ulnar abduction, and the radiocarpal ligaments hold them together in flexion and extension. The strength of the radiocarpal ligaments also ensures that when the radius rotates, the hand goes with it. Before we move on to look at the muscles, let's review what we've seen of the bones and joints. On the humerus, here's the medial epicondyle and epicondylar ridge, and the lateral epicondyle and epicondylar ridge. Here's the capitulum and the trochlea. On the proximal ulna, here's the trochlear notch, the olecranon, the coronoid process, the ulnar tuberosity, and the radial notch. On the proximal radius, here's the head, the neck, and the radial tuberosity. Here's the radial collateral ligament, the annular ligament, the ulnar collateral ligament, and the joint capsule. On the distal ulna, here's the head and the ulnar styloid. On the distal radius, here's the surface for the ulna, the surface for the wrist joint, and the radial styloid. Here's the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetral and pisiform, the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. And here are the metacarpals. At the wrist, here's the triangular fibrocartilage, the radial collateral ligament, the ulnar collateral ligament, the palmar radiocarpal,